No man's land. Just the name was enough to chill soldiers in World War I. This desolate strip between trenches was a place almost no one survived. Barbed wire, endless mud, landmines, and constant machine gun fire turned it into a killing ground. Crossing it often meant a death sentence, and the numbers of men lost there are almost beyond belief. But there's one thing about no man's land that you would never guess. An incident so shocking it defies everything you think you know about the battlefield. We'll reveal that later in the video, so stay with us as we uncover why this was the most dangerous place on Earth. The phrase no man's land wasn't born in the trenches of World War I, but it was here that it gained its most infamous meaning. Before 1914, the term appeared in medieval times to describe disputed or lawless ground, places no one dared to settle. But in the Great War, soldiers on both sides adopted it to describe the strip of earth between opposing trenches, a zone so dangerous it was practically uninhabitable. It was land without ownership, because to stand there for more than a moment meant gambling with your life. This lethal ground stretched for hundreds of miles across the Western Front. In some sectors, like parts of Flanders, it was only a few dozen yards wide, so narrow that soldiers claimed they could hear the enemy coughing at night. In other places, such as around Verdun, it stretched several hundred yards, a cratered wasteland visible for miles. Regardless of size, the danger was absolute. Both armies kept their trenches dug deep, leaving the space between them exposed to constant surveillance and firepower. To step into it was to be seen, and to be seen was to invite death. Soldiers quickly came to fear the very mention of no man's land. It wasn't just geography, it was a sentence. Letters home reveal how men described it with a mix of dread and resignation. One British soldier called it a graveyard waiting to swallow you whole. A German veteran wrote, "The land between was not earth, but purgatory." These testimonies weren't exaggerations. Everything about this stretch of ground reinforced its reputation. The churned-up soil, the tangled barbed wire, the blackened stumps of trees, and the bodies that could not be retrieved. Each element reminded men of what happened when they dared to cross it. And yet, crossing it was unavoidable. Generals ordered men over the top to storm enemy trenches, knowing they'd have to advance through no man's land. Patrols crept into it at night to gather intelligence or capture prisoners. Stretcher bearers risked it to drag the wounded back to safety. Whether advancing, scouting, or rescuing, every step across this zone was made under the constant shadow of death. No man's land wasn't just a physical barrier. It was the most potent symbol of the stalemate that defined World War I. Every soldier knew it. Every soldier feared it. And tragically, millions of soldiers would enter it, never to return. When the guns of August 1914 first roared across Europe, generals on all sides believed the war would be short, decided by bold offensives and sweeping cavalry charges. But by the winter of that year, those illusions were buried under the mud of northern France and Belgium. The machine gun, the rapid-fire artillery piece, and the sheer resilience of defending infantry created something the world had never seen before, a battlefield that refused to move. With both sides unable to break through, they dug in, and between their zigzagging trench lines stretched a new kind of wilderness, no man's land. The Western Front quickly became a vast scar across the continent. The trench systems ran from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland, hundreds of miles of dugouts, parapets, and fortified positions. Where the opposing trenches faced each other, the ground in between became the dreaded zone neither side controlled. Its size varied by location, sometimes barely more than 30 yards across, other times several hundred yards. At Ypres, British and German trenches were so close that soldiers swore they could hear the enemy's conversations at night. At the Somme, the open ground stretched far enough that advancing soldiers felt utterly exposed, like targets in a shooting gallery. And yet, no man's land was not optional. It was the obstacle every army had to cross if they wanted to win. Offensive strategies, drilled into military doctrine, insisted that the way to break the stalemate was to send men over the top. The orders were simple and merciless. climb out of the trench, march across no man's land, and capture the enemy's trench. Soldiers knew it was suicide. Many wrote their families farewell notes the night before a scheduled attack, understanding they would likely never return. Even when full-scale assaults weren't ordered, soldiers couldn't avoid the peril of this zone. Night patrols were dispatched to scout enemy wire, cut gaps for future attacks, or raid listening posts. These missions often ended in brutal hand-to-hand fighting in the darkness, with knives and bayonets used to keep silent. Stretcher bearers, some of the bravest men on the front, crawled into no man's land under fire to retrieve the wounded, dragging them back through mud and wire. Each mission carried the same risk: exposure, detection, and death. By 1915, every soldier on the Western Front understood a grim truth. The war was no longer about sweeping maneuvers or quick victories. It was about inching forward across no man's land, foot by foot, at a cost measured in thousands of lives for every patch of ground. This lethal strip of earth had become the defining feature of World War I, and for those who faced it, it was nothing less than a nightmare carved into the soil of Europe. To look at no man's land was to look at a place stripped of life itself. Artillery had pounded the ground so relentlessly that once green fields were reduced to mud and craters. Trees were splintered into stumps, villages leveled into piles of brick. The earth was gouged open in every direction, crater upon crater, overlapping into a jagged, uneven surface. Rain filled these holes, and the clay soil of northern France turned them into thick, sucking bogs. Soldiers described men sinking waist-deep, sometimes chest-deep, into mud that swallowed them whole. At Passchendaele in 1917, entire units disappeared into the mire, drowning in silence, while their comrades watched helplessly. Barbed wire was everywhere. Both armies strung it across no man's land in dense belts that could be dozens of yards thick. At night, patrols crept forward with wire cutters, only to find the twisted metal nearly impossible to cut quickly under fire. More than one soldier became tangled in it, thrashing desperately as machine gun bullets cut him down. Many bodies were left hanging in the wire, grotesque silhouettes visible to both sides, reminders of what awaited the next attackers. Wire was meant to slow down the enemy, but for the men charging across, it became a trap, guaranteeing exposure to the killing fields. Then there were the mines and traps. Both sides buried explosives in shallow pits across no man's land, designed to maim and terrify. Even when the guns were quiet, the land itself was a weapon. A soldier crossing at night never knew if his next step would trigger an explosion. Some accounts speak of men being blown apart mid-patrol, the survivors forced to crawl back to their lines, knowing their comrades' remains were scattered in the darkness. And all around, the dead lay where they fell. Retrieving bodies during the day was suicide, so corpses often remained in the open for weeks. In letters, soldiers wrote of the unbearable stench of decay carried by the wind, of rats as large as cats feeding on the fallen. Sometimes men crawled past the faces of friends left behind during previous attacks. No man's land became a graveyard without markers, a place where the dead outnumbered the living. This was the landscape soldiers were ordered to cross. Not just mud and wire, but a nightmare stitched together by violence. Every crater, every twisted strand of wire, every body was a reminder. This ground did not belong to the living. No man's land was not just a place between trenches. It was a vision of hell carved into the earth, daring men to try their luck against it. If the landscape of no man's land looked like hell, the weapons trained upon it made sure it lived up to the name. Any soldier who climbed over the top instantly entered a killing ground designed for maximum destruction. The moment a helmet or rifle barrel appeared above the parapet, machine guns opened fire. These weren't single rifles firing sporadically. They were belt-fed monsters like the German MG-08, spitting hundreds of rounds per minute. The fields of fire overlapped, so entire stretches of no man's land were pre-sighted death zones. Soldiers advancing in neat lines, as the tactics of the time demanded, were cut down in rows. Veterans described seeing men collapse as though an invisible scythe had passed through them. Artillery compounded the nightmare. Both sides hammered no man's land with constant shelling, turning the ground into craters and blasting apart anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the open. Before every major attack, friendly artillery would bombard enemy positions in an effort to cut barbed wire and destroy machine gun nests. But the barrages rarely succeeded completely. Wire remained intact, bunkers survived, and when the shelling stopped, defenders scrambled back to their positions, waiting for the advancing infantry. Worse still, attacking soldiers had to clamber out of their trenches and cross through the very same shattered ground that had just been shelled, often under counter-bombardments that landed short. The most terrifying aspect of no man's land was the total lack of cover. Unlike in the trenches, where sandbags and dugouts gave some protection, this barren zone offered nothing. A man could drop flat in the mud, but that left him exposed to shrapnel or suffocation in a flooded shell hole. Even moving forward was slow and exhausting, as every step risked tripping into wire or slipping into craters, and all the while, enemy gunners tracked every movement. Crossfire made the danger even worse. Defenses were designed so that anyone who survived fire from one position would walk straight into the sights of another. Soldiers advancing under this lethal geometry often realized that survival was almost impossible. One British survivor of the Somme recalled watching entire platoons vanish in the time it took to light a cigarette. No man's land was not just a strip of ground. It was a carefully engineered killing zone. The defenders held every advantage, with their guns, artillery, and mortars covering every inch of exposed earth. To enter it was to face the full force of modern industrial warfare, and, more often than not, to never return. If machine guns and artillery weren't enough, no man's land became even deadlier with the arrival of new weapons that pushed warfare into darker territory. Among them was poison gas. Released in massive clouds or fired by shell, it drifted across the battlefield and settled in the low points of no man's land. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas lingered in shell craters, invisible and silent killers. Soldiers crawling forward often didn't realize they were breathing poison until their lungs began to burn. Mustard gas clung to skin and uniforms, blistering flesh and blinding eyes. Gas masks offered some protection, but they were heavy, claustrophobic, and could fail if even slightly damaged. Soldiers described the terror of tearing them off in desperation, only to inhale death itself. No man's land became not just a place of bullets and shells, but of suffocating clouds that turned the very air toxic. Flamethrowers were another nightmare weapon. German units used them to clear trenches, but to reach the enemy, operators had to cross parts of no man's land first. For attackers, carrying one was nearly a death sentence. The tanks of pressurized fuel on their backs made them priority targets. When fired, the jet of burning liquid could sweep across a trench, igniting everything it touched. To defenders who witnessed it, it was a vision of hell. Men running, engulfed in fire, their screams echoing across the battlefield. Even if rare compared to machine guns or artillery, the psychological impact of flamethrowers in no man's land was immense. Then there were the night raids. Darkness offered the only cover for moving through no man's land, and both sides used it for patrols. Small groups of men crawled out under the eerie glow of flares, cutting wire, scouting enemy positions, or attempting to capture prisoners. These missions often ended in brutal silence. Bayonets, knives, and clubs were preferred to avoid drawing fire. Many never returned, their bodies lost in the mud. Soldiers on listening posts described the constant strain of waiting for footsteps or whispers in the dark, knowing enemy patrols were just a few yards away. Even sleep brought no relief, as flares and sporadic gunfire shattered the night, reminding everyone that danger lurked just beyond the parapet. By day, no man's land was a slaughterhouse. By night, it was a haunted wilderness, where unseen enemies crept close enough to breathe the same air. Gas, fire, and midnight raids added new layers of horror to an already cursed landscape, making it clear that in no man's land, death could come at any hour, in any form. No man's land wasn't just feared because of its terrain or weapons, it was feared because of what it did to human life. It became the place where entire generations were lost. Every major offensive demanded men cross it, and every major offensive left tens of thousands dead or wounded on its soil. The casualty numbers tell the story more brutally than words ever could. On July 1st, 1916, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, British soldiers climbed from their trenches and began advancing across no man's land in long, steady lines. They were confident. The artillery barrage that preceded them was supposed to have smashed German defenses, but the German machine guns were waiting. In just a few hours, the British suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 killed, the single bloodiest day in British military history. Most of those men fell in no man's land, cut down before they ever reached enemy wire. One officer recalled, "They kept walking forward, even as the ranks melted away. They just kept coming until there was no one left." At Verdun in 1916, French soldiers faced months of constant assaults. The fighting was so relentless that the dead were never fully recovered. Today, ossuaries at Verdun still hold the remains of over 150,000 unidentified soldiers, many of them lost forever in the blasted ground of no man's land. To walk across Verdun even now is to tread on a graveyard that swallowed an entire generation. Then came Passchendaele, Third Ypres, in 1917, where no man's land turned into a sea of mud. Soldiers charging into the swamp-like craters didn't just fear bullets, they feared drowning. Eyewitnesses described men sinking helplessly, their cries muffled as the mud closed over their heads. In some cases, comrades tried to pull them out, only to be dragged down themselves. Survivors said this was one of the most horrifying ways to die, because it came slowly, in full view of others. Even when men survived crossing no man's land, many carried wounds that ended their lives later. Stretcher bearers, crawling under fire, retrieved who they could, but countless others lay stranded between the lines, crying out through the day until their voices faded. Sometimes, their comrades were forced to listen for hours or even days, unable to help until nightfall, and often by then, it was too late. Statistically, survival rates in major offensives were appalling. In some battles, fewer than 1 in 3 men sent across no man's land made it back unscathed. Some units suffered casualty rates of 80 to 90% in a single attack. It's no wonder soldiers called it the graveyard between the trenches. No man's land didn't just take lives, it consumed them, leaving behind a generation of widows, orphans, and lost futures. The human cost of this strip of earth is why it remains etched into memory. Every inch of ground gained in no man's land was bought with blood, and often it was lost again in the next counterattack. It was the perfect embodiment of World War I's futility. Men dying by the thousands for a few yards of mud they could never truly hold. After hearing of all the horror, it might seem impossible to imagine anything human or even humane happening in no man's land. And yet, in December of 1914, only months into the war, something extraordinary occurred. It's one of those stories that soldiers who lived through it never forgot, and historians still point to it as almost unbelievable: the Christmas truce. On Christmas Eve, across sectors of the Western Front, British and German soldiers began singing carols from their trenches. Voices carried over the wire and shell holes, rising into the winter night. First, it was tentative, Silent Night in German, answered by the First Noel in English. But soon, soldiers from both sides were joining in. By morning, a few brave men climbed cautiously out of their trenches and began walking into no man's land unarmed. Instead of being shot, they were met by soldiers doing the same from the other side. What followed was a moment that defied the logic of war. Men shook hands, exchanged small gifts of tobacco, chocolate, and buttons. They showed each other photographs of wives and children. Most famously, in some places, they played improvised games of football on the very ground, where, days before, men had been torn apart by machine gun fire. The same no man's land that usually spelled certain death briefly became a space of laughter and humanity. One British soldier later wrote, "Here we were, fighting them one day, and shaking hands the next. It was, if we had all agreed, this madness could not last forever. The truce didn't last long. Commanders on both sides were furious and quickly forbade such fraternization. Within days, artillery fire shattered the peace, and no man's land reverted to its role as a slaughterhouse. But the fact that it happened at all is shocking. In the deadliest zone on Earth, soldiers proved they were still human beings, capable of compassion even while surrounded by death. The Christmas truce became a legend, one of the most unexpected events in military history. It showed that beneath the uniforms and orders, the men on both sides shared the same fears, longings, and weariness of the war. That they could, even for a few hours, transform no man's land from a graveyard into a place of peace is what makes this incident so unforgettable. It's the one thing few would ever guess about no man's land, and it's proof that even in hell, humanity flickered, however briefly. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, soldiers finally climbed out of their trenches and walked into no man's land without the fear of machine gun fire. But what they found was almost as terrifying as the war itself, a devastated landscape that looked less like Earth and more like the surface of another planet. Shell craters overlapped each other in endless scars. Trees had been blasted to stumps. Villages were so pulverized that locals sometimes couldn't find where their houses had once stood. And beneath the surface lay something even worse. The war had left the land poisoned, unstable, and lethally unsafe. In France, the worst areas were marked as the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone. These were stretches of former battlefield deemed so contaminated by explosives, chemical agents, and corpses that they could never be rebuilt or farmed again. To this day, some of these zones remain off-limits, fenced off by the French government. They are still littered with millions of tons of unexploded shells, rusting barbed wire, and chemical residue from gas warfare. Farmers working nearby fields continue to discover bombs and grenades every year in what is grimly called the Iron Harvest. Even more than a century later, the ground of no man's land is dangerous, still capable of killing. For locals returning after the war, the devastation was heartbreaking. Some villages were officially declared destroyed and never rebuilt, their names preserved only on memorial stones. Instead, pine forests were planted to cover the scarred earth. But no amount of greenery could hide the truth that these areas were mass graves. Tens of thousands of missing soldiers still lie beneath the soil, their remains mingled with mud, wire, and shell fragments. Verdun alone holds over 150,000 unidentified dead, many of whom vanished forever into the ground of no man's land. Even where rebuilding was possible, reminders of the battlefield never disappeared. Farmers plowing their fields unearthed bones, helmets, and bullets for decades. Children growing up in northern France and Belgium in the 1920s played among abandoned trenches and wreck bunkers, unknowingly surrounded by unexploded ordnance. Some still die today when buried shells detonate unexpectedly. The shocking truth is that no man's land didn't stop being deadly in 1918. In a sense, it has never stopped. The soil remains poisoned, the shells remain hidden, and the ghosts of millions still haunt the ground. Even a century later, this cursed land proves why it deserves the title of the most dangerous place on Earth.